Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I had Barbara Annis in New York City. Barbara is the founder and CEO of Gender Intelligence Group. She works to build greater understanding of the unique differences that men and women bring to business. She's also the author of multiple books, including Results at the Top, Using Gender Intelligence to Create Breakthrough Growth. Barbara encourages people to move away from the concept of great minds think alike to great minds think unalike. Barbara, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure, absolutely.
Well, it's so nice to meet you. I mentioned before we got started, this is a topic I tend to totally avoid. I studied computer engineering, and I've often been the only woman where I've worked over the years. What has inspired you to get involved in gender intelligence and to speak out on this topic?
Well, I was actually exactly like you. I totally avoided it. You know, I started my career at Sony, being the first saleswoman at Sony, and then went into various levels of management after that. But I actually adopted very male behavior because it was a very male sales culture, right? And they literally, believe it or not, you know, in the first year, even though I won Rookie of the Year, Rookie Salesperson of the Year, back then they said Salesman of the Year and gave me a male watch, but that's a long time ago. But they, you know, what was interesting is that my boss said, you know, you're good with the clients, you're really good, but you need some assertiveness training. And they sent me to a course called Guerrilla War Tactics for Women in Business in San Francisco.
Okay.
And it kind of taught me all the alpha male behavior, right? And that I needed to boom your voice, you know, all of those things, spread your things around, be the first one to interrupt, you know, really, really nonsense things. Mm-hmm. But I went back and applied it at Sony, and my manager at the end of the year, when he gave me his written feedback, said that I'd become a very dangerous woman, right? So before I lacked assertiveness, now I was dangerous, right? So it was like a catch-22, right, in terms of trying to fit in.
Oh, wow.
So what really caught me, my attention on this, and really why I've, you know, spent 30 years now on this topic, almost solely, is that I saw gender differences, and I always thought there were socialized differences and that we could change them, right? And then I actually began to read the neuroscience of gender differences, and it blew me away. I mean, it blew me away. And I think there's so much still today, even today, denial around that. You know, we try to avoid talking about differences because it's not politically correct, or we don't want to be biased, or all those things, right? But really, that neuroscience of gender differences really can transform the culture in organizations when you have both men and women working and winning together. So that's really what caught my attention.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting when you talk about the training, because it reminds me of, I was sort of told, you know, that you should sort of put your hands on the table and spread your arms out and spread your things out on the table. Like, oh, it's such a challenge. Well, you talk about, and I've heard you speak a few times, you talk about the idea of culture fit. And what is that when we talk about culture fit, and why could it potentially be bad as we're sort of looking maybe to hire new employees, for example?
Yeah, I say that often if you're hiring or promoting men or women of all diverse backgrounds, right, is that if you use cultural fit with the mindset of sameness, right, is this going to be a good fit for our team? Because our team is really great right now, right? So it's really moving from a great minds think alike to great minds think unalike. And when you use cultural fit, sometimes you actually, you know, there's Silicon Valley call it meritocracy, and that means if I see myself in the mirror, I'll hire you, kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. So there's that sameness hiring, and so one really needs to be conscious of that.
Right. I totally agree, and it's really difficult.
And it goes, by the way, mm-hmm. it goes for men as well. You know, we work also with clients who have more women, like cosmetic companies as an example, right? Mm-hmm. And they're hiring men in, and they go, no, he's not going to be a good fit for our team, right? Because he doesn't fit their female paradigm. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm,
it's really important that we actually shift that way of thinking.
I actually saw that recently with a job seeker who was very passionately looking for a job at this organization that was almost all women. He would have been the only man. And they overlooked him and hired someone that was a little less qualified because they just felt like he just didn't fit in. And I remember talking to him, and he was really upset because he felt like there was nothing else he could have done, differently.
Yeah, this is perfect example. We often talk about women in that example, right? They tried everything and couldn't fit in, but it happens on the other side too.
Mm-hmm.
And this poor guy, who probably was the best at that job, right? Potentially, right? Couldn't get in because there was sort of a little bit of a disruption there for the women, right?
That's exactly the word. It was disruption. It was totally, that was exactly it.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Silicon Valley and sameness, and I think our conversation is pretty timely because Google recently had an issue that we've all kind of seen in the news where somebody actually wrote a memo who works inside of Google talking about how women are less kind of, quote, biologically suited to be engineers than men. And gosh, that was just really shocking, I think, to see that. But I'm curious what your take on the situation in Silicon Valley is and kind of what can we do in an environment like Silicon Valley? What can we do to make it more friendly to women?
Well, it really is about transforming the culture, right? And I mean, the neuroscience of gender differences, you can go into what I call a lot of conclusions. Say, oh, I see, that is why. No, women make brilliant engineers. Women are brilliant in technology companies, right? But there are some differences that we need to recognize and value and actually take advantage of, right? As an example, I'll just give it to you briefly. Mm-hmm. For example, in innovative thinking or problem solving, men tend to use convergent thinking and women tend to use divergent thinking, right? So converge on the problem, let's look at the issue, look at the pros and the cons, and women diverge like more a web-like thinking, but because there are more connections to the right and the left hemisphere of the brain. And, we've been applying this in all our client business, and they see this tremendous advantage, and it's actually featured in the book, Results at the Top, that difference produces better results, right? But back to your question around culture, that's really where we need to transform, because I see, especially in technology, I see a lot of women, and some men, by the way, who might not fit that culture, right? And they go to the big or the medium-sized technology companies, and within, 4 to 5 years, they quit, they leave. They have a much higher turnover, or even worse, they quit and stay. Mm-hmm. Right? And say, okay, I call it the sticky floor. They just get stuck at a certain level. They're not going to move any further because they don't really want to have to do that, right? Mm-hmm. Or they just leave, period, right? And it's a culture phenomenon, right? So that's really where companies need to pay their attention, is how can you really transform the culture so it's an inclusive culture that values differences, period.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you mentioned why, that women that people often leave, and why do you think that is? I mean, it's somewhat obvious, but from your research and people that you've talked to, why do you think that happens?
Well, it's really fascinating that it's consistent throughout the world that men and women tend to leave for different reasons. And often the common corporate myth is that women leave because of work-life balance, because that's what women end up saying they do, because it's the politically correct thing. They don't want to burn their bridges, and they'll say things like, I'm leaving for personal reasons, right? And that, of course, equates to work-life balance. And men tend to leave for a better opportunity elsewhere, right? They want to have a new opportunity or a better opportunity. Women leave because they don't feel valued. They don't feel valued for bringing their authentic self to work, right? And then there's a sidebar to that. They also don't see a future progression in their career. Am I going to end up there? I don't think so. I don't think it's going to happen, right? And that could be because they don't see a powerful role model that they relate to, or they don't see enough women. There might be various reasons. But the fundamental reason is women don't feel valued.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. It actually reminds me, my very first job when I was still in school for engineering, I worked for General Motors, and I worked in an assembly plant that made the Chevy Malibu. And I was redesigning parts on the cars. And I remember, first of all, that the plant manager said to my boss, "Who is this little girl and what is she doing with my cars?" And that plant manager would follow me around, and sometimes he would sit in the car in the passenger seat if I was testing it. And then as I would walk through the assembly line, through the assembly floor, the assembly line workers would actually throw little pieces of plastic parts at me to try to get my attention, almost like they were trying to flirt with me. And when I came out of college, General Motors offered me a full-time job managing an assembly line, and I thought, how in the world will I ever do that job? That's like, there's no way I can do that job. And that was one of the reasons that I went away from engineering. And I rarely talk about that because it's difficult and it's hard to explain. But when you're being kind of catcalled at work or called that little girl, it's really hard to operate as an engineer.
Yeah, and that the sad part of that story. Mm-hmm. How long ago was that, by the way?
That was in 1998.
Okay. The sad part of that story, I hear this story in 2017 from women engineers. Mm-hmm. And here they have, worked, their heart out in graduating top and being tested through school and college, etc., right? And then they get in and they have these kind of what I call water torture experiences, right? Mm-hmm. And like the example you just gave, and it's so fixable. It's so fixable, but we have to have the eyes to see it. And we also have to really understand the impact that has on women, right? I was just talking to a woman from Boston who was a biochemical engineer, and she said, I will never, ever go back to that type of job again, ever. Mm-hmm. And I loved my job, but I didn't love the environment. Mm-hmm. Right? And that was, today, right? So
I totally agree. Yeah, and it is, like you said, the eyes to see it. I actually had a conversation about 2 days ago with a male engineer that I know, and he was saying, I know that those things go on, but they don't go on at my company. My company is different. We treat everyone the same. And I said, have you ever asked any of the women that you work with if they believe that? And he said, no, but I know that's how it is. And I said, are there any women that are in management positions? And he said, no, but I know it's this, everyone's being treated fairly. And I've never been to this person's work before. Maybe everyone is being treated fairly, but I think if you don't ask and you don't have the conversations, and especially if women aren't in positions of power, it's really hard to make the case that everything is fair.
I hope he's listening to this because there's some great learning here. Mm-hmm. Here's the thing. When you don't know, you don't know, right? What the experience is like for women, you're never going to have the line of sight. And you can have men have the best of intentions, and he has the best of intentions. Right, and wanting both men and women to succeed and be happy, and etc., right? But he has a blind spot. He doesn't know how it lands for women. So I would recommend, if he's listening, do your homework, stand in the shoes of women and ask the questions, and make sure you're getting an authentic conversation. I'm going to give you an example because men love examples, right? So I was just talking to a large technology company. He was running sales, right? And he had called me and he said, "Help! I need help." And I said, "What's going on?" He said, "I've got a gender breakdown." I think he called it, right? And I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, I've hired in some new men from our competitors, etc. And the women have come to my office saying, 'This is awful. I can't work here.' And thank God they were at least straight enough to come and do that and not just leave, right?" Mm-hmm. And they said they felt dismissed by these guys. They felt excluded. The real meeting after the meeting, that kind of thing. And they just feel. And one of the women said to him, and this really resonated because I hear it all the time, said, "I feel like I'm a complete different person at work than I am at home, and that's exhausting." Mm. Right. So I'll just leave that with the gentleman that you spoke to. Hopefully he can hear that. But the key in this, by the way, is that you've got to do your homework, right? And we call it KSI, so knowledge, strategy, implementation. And often companies go to strategy too soon. They don't stay in the knowledge phase to say, okay, what's actually going on, right? So what we do is we do a gender, inclusiveness, diversity diagnostic, right? So we really look at what are the root causes and what are men and women saying about things. And you see these huge differences for the most part. Sometimes there are similarities, but a lot of the times there are differences in how men and women are viewing the culture and thriving in that organization.
Mm-hmm.
And once you have the eyes to see that, you can solve for it.
Oh, that's so interesting. And how do you do the diagnostic work? Do you interview people? How does that happen?
We actually have an online tool that we use that is so robust, it's incredible. Because the focus groups and interviews are good, but when you have really the solid research with the facts, right, and say, look, here are 2,000 men and women, I'm just making up a number here, right, 1,500 men, 500 women as an example, right, and this is what they're saying, right, and look at the deviations between men and women, and look at the deviations generationally or culturally, right, and then we kind of storyboard it for them, and then we say, oh, here are the 5 themes that you need to solve for, and here's what you can do about it, right? We had one engineering company, they did it brilliantly. In 9 months, they had historically, a very command and control culture, right? And in 9 months, and kudos to them, not to us, trust me, they did the homework. 9 months, they transformed their culture.
Wow.
Yeah, that's record-breaking time.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it is record-breaking, yeah.
Wow. That's very fortunate. I feel like when you're on the receiving end, sometimes it can feel like that's impossible. So it's good to know that that is possible.
Well, there was one, I'll just give you really quickly, woman engineer, so she said, I've been with this firm for 22 years, and this is the first time I absolutely feel valued.
Wow.
Right? Men are reaching out to me, asking me for my opinion. Even my CEO is calling me. I feel like I've won $1 million, right? So, and then, of course, she also said, I wish that could have happened 22 years ago, but I said, let's not go there. Let's just be happy that it's happened now, right?
Yeah, you can't change the past,
No.
for sure. Well, you mentioned the meeting after the meeting, and I think this is a really important topic because often as women, I think, at least I was taught, if you work hard, you'll be rewarded. And we focus really on the work. And I think there is a really big component to the networking or the meeting after the meeting that actually plays a pretty big role in our success that we don't always think about. And so I'm curious, when you talk to sort of young women who are professionals, how do you talk to them about this issue and how it impacts their ability to kind of move up the ladder?
Well, I think that, so first of all, we've done over 8,000 workshops, and in the beginning, we ask men and women their perceptions. We don't give them any data, no information. We just stand in their shoes. And these themes come up. So for men, for example, they feel they have to be careful and cautious, and they feel blamed, right? And they feel they walk on eggshells in giving women feedback, as an example, right? Women say things like the value piece that we already talked about, but also the networking piece, the real meeting after the meeting. The guys go out for a beer, they go to play sports or whatever, right? So there's actually something women can do. Most men do this very wisely and naturally, and it's called strategic networking, right? So who is it that I need to network with, right? So I have this 5-year plan, right? So it's very focused, right? I have this 5-year plan, and I need to meet the key influencers that I don't know now, right? That I need to know that can advance my 5-year plan, right? Women tend to network for relationships, right? Like, who do I relate to and like, right? Men don't really care if they like the guy or not, or
That's
the woman,
true.
right? But he or she is a key influencer, so I gotta get their attention, right? So that's something that for us we can really learn to be more strategic, and I even see it when I speak. I do a lot of keynotes all over the world, and I see women kind of hanging out with who they know, right? And men are kind of checking the room, looking at a directory, seeing who's in the room, who I need to go to, right? At the break, So that's something that we can learn to do, and we are very good at networking.
Right.
It's not. We don't lack the skill. It's the strategic part that we need to add to it.
You're right. Well, so I hate to keep bringing in personal examples, but I think they happen to be somewhat relevant here. I'll tell you, as I became an executive in my own career, what I noticed was that a lot of people, you mentioned sports, a lot of the executives that I worked with would play golf. And I didn't know how to play golf. And so I thought, I should learn how to play golf. And I signed up and I was taking lessons a couple of days a week. And I was going to the driving range almost every day. And I thought, once I learn to play golf, I'll be able to go golfing with the other executives and I'll be able to be included in the meeting after the meeting. And interestingly, even after I learned to play golf, I wasn't being invited to play golf because they were looking for another man to play golf. They weren't looking for a woman. And I don't know if you have any suggestions for that kind of situation. It's like, even if you're trying to be a strategic networker, I feel like there are times when just because of your gender, you're still not included in it. How do you work around that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great point you're making, Angela, because there's equal learning for both men and women in this concept, right, around gender intelligence, right? So for you did exactly what coaches would coach you to do, right, or mentors would mentor you to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go and learn how to play golf, right? I mean, a lot of companies have golf lessons for women, you know what I mean? To
right.
Get them to, be skilled. But what you're not doing, and you can't do yourself, is increase men's comfort level, right? Mm-hmm. In really partnering with women and having a good time and enjoying themselves, right? So we find often that, and we do these one-on-one action sessions for senior executive men, right? And the first thing they say is this, and we cover 240,000 people, so we have a lot of data, right? And they say, I have these two direct report women. They're fantastic. They're doing a fantastic job. I just don't feel comfortable traveling with them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or going out for dinner. I mean, if I go out for dinner, what would people think? That kind of thing.
Right.
So we need to increase men's comfort zone very much, right? So that we can break that barrier, right? Because it is a created barrier, and it's out of the concern for being misinterpreted. I mean, I worked with a trading floor not too long ago, and they never. So women traders, men traders. Not a lot of women traders, but there were some, right?
Mm-hmm.
The men never invited them out to lunch, or especially out for a beer after work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I said, well, why don't you come up with a strategic plan? I said, well, if I go out with Sophie, they're all going to gossip about us, right?
Mm.
I said, well, go out as a group, right? So they did this thing. They started with gender lunches, right, on Monday, right? And then eventually it got so normalized that it didn't even occur to them anymore that there was any discomfort of any kind, right? So we just need to be smart about get this going, start the domino effect so we can remove that altogether.
Yeah, I totally agree. I know that with my golf example, I really realized what was happening when there was a day when a group of the guys went to play golf and they were short one player. And I thought, oh, this is my chance, And they actually found someone who had a broken arm to go with them.
Oh, my goodness.
And I thought, you were going to take the guy with the broken arm? Like,
well, that speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Right. Oh, but I think you're right. I think you're right. It's about normalizing it so that there is less gossip and less discomfort about the whole situation. And
also not about blame, right? It's about understanding.
Oh, sure.
Right? Because a lot of the times, I interview women and they have all these experiences. And men don't react very well, I'm sure you know that, to blame. But let's come up with some solutions together, right? So we can resolve this. And that's in the workshops, that's what we do. At the end of the session, they come up with their own plan and they implement their own plan. And that's what happened with this engineering company that transformed their culture in 9 months. They took it on. The CEO, the top executives took this on and walked the talk, right? And began implementing change, right? Mm-hmm. So really, and we know the leaders set the tone for culture, right? So that can accelerate, 1,000-fold that way.
I totally agree. I completely agree. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, another thing I saw an entire blog post on your website about this topic, mansplaining. So I wanted to touch on that one too. I actually recently had an issue. To be specific, I was looking for a new office to move my business into a different office location. And I was calling and emailing and I couldn't figure out why no one was calling me back. And a male friend of mine thought he would be helpful, and he emailed a couple of places. And he immediately got responses, and he forwarded them to me, and he said, oh, look, I've got some help for you here. And I looked, and they were the same people who I had been emailing and I had been calling that weren't calling me back. And they emailed him immediately. And I ended up having to get him to help me to get my new office, even though I was the one paying for it and the one who would be working out of it. It was really frustrating. And I ended up posting it on my personal Facebook page, which I don't typically do, but I was like kind of venting that I felt really frustrated. And I had a male colleague of mine from business school who jumped into the conversation and started explaining that that was impossible, that had happened to me. And he went on a whole explanation as to why it must have been a misunderstanding, that this wasn't possibly the experience I was having. I don't know. I was wondering, based on your post, it's like, why are we doing this to each other? It's like, how can we stop? And, I don't know. It was so frustrating to me, both to have the experience happen and then to have a friend explain that the experience didn't happen.
Yes, which dismissed it altogether.
Right.
It's fascinating. So these are called what we call common gender blind spots, right? So we have these common assumptions that we make, blind spots that we have, right? So whoever you were trying to reach had an assumption that you weren't the key decision maker, right? Let me give you some mind-blowing stats. You ready?
Yeah.
So this is a financial investment firm who called us a couple of years ago, and they said, help. And I said, what's going on? They said 72% of our female clients have fired our financial advisor within 1 year of their spouse passing away.
Yeah.
And we have no idea why. And they've already left. And I said, well, I can absolutely tell you why, right? You didn't know them, right? You made assumptions that they weren't key influencers or key decision makers. You ignored their needs, right? You paid more attention to the male as being the key buyer of the investment, right? And they came back to me a few months later and they say, you're absolutely spot on, right? So it's basically blind spots. And your friend from business school, I mean, God bless him, he's coming from his own paradigm, his own mindset, because he's right in the sense that can't possibly happen. And you know what? It does. But it's just our own, we don't know, so it's a blind spot. I'm going to give you an example because I'm baby boomer age, right? And I was just a few months ago, I was with my husband down in Florida looking for we wanted to buy a place, right? And it was expensive, right? And we wanted it on the beach, the coast, etc. And I had emailed the realtor. She was a she, right? And when I got there, so we arranged it when we were going to meet. We met her in the office, and she had a kind of a beautiful, kind of glossy kind of portfolio of the different listings inside of the binder. And on the binder itself, she had Paul Reed Curry. That was my husband, right?
Okay.
And I was buying. Right? I'm the one who has the money.
Right.
And it was just like, even women can make these assumptions, right? These stereotypical assumptions, right? That's not the decision maker. So now what can we do about that? I could have, and you could have too, said, I'm actually the buyer, remove that assumption right up front. Right? Use much more clear language in terms of, really declaring your intention, right? In a very explicit way. It might have removed some of it. We don't know, but it's a good chance that it could have, right?
Sure. Do you think it becomes threatening in some way, though, when you say those things right up front?
I've gotten over the threatening thing.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
That's kind of like caretaking versus mansplaining, right?
Yeah.
So I've kind of gotten over that. I can be very direct, and I just make requests. I have requests, right? And I did mention it to her. And I said, I know where you're coming from, and I know you had the best of intentions, right? But in the future, think about that and test your assumptions and put both names on the binder, right?
Yeah.
And put them side by side. Don't put them one on top of the other, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And she went, oh my goodness, you're absolutely right. I mean, she was so thankful.
Right.
But she will never do that again.
I hope she was a little bit embarrassed.
Yes, she was. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw it, but just this week there was an article that came out about a startup that was started, I think it was in Silicon Valley, by two women, and they were having such a hard time getting people to be respectful to them through email, that they made up a third partner to their business. And it's a non-existent person, but they created an email address for him.
Yeah.
And they were emailing as a man. I can't remember if the name was like Kevin. I can't remember. But they said it was like night and day, the way that people would address Kevin, let's say, versus them. And gosh, that's interesting. And what an interesting solution. I don't know that that's the right solution, but man, it's surprising.
I mean, it's all about awareness, right? And we just need to create more awareness around this because, I have had many women who've just not created a third person, a male person, but used their initials, right? JP, JP Anderson kind of thing, right? And it was really Judy, right?
Right.
So that they could get, and they really noticed a difference in response rate and much more timely response rate when they did that. Right?
So interesting. Gosh, I want to test that now.
So we have a lot. There's a lot of learning on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Right, equal learning for both.
No, absolutely. I totally agree. Well, so we talked a little bit about the way that you diagnose companies. How does a company decide if they're going to come to you and ask for help with this issue? Is it usually a top-level executive? I mean, how does a company initially kind of engage?
Yeah, I mean, either they read something about us or hear something, referral, right? We get a lot of CEOs who share it with other CEOs. But the company typically come with us either with some questions around we're having trouble recruiting women, right? Or we're just having trouble recruiting, period, right? Or we've just seen some, we've done employee surveys and there's some, discrepancy here and we'd like you to have a look at that, right? Or our turnover is going up and up, right? So we had, for example, an accounting firm who were recruiting 55 to 62% female accountants, but they were losing them at a rate of 27% versus 10% men.
Wow.
Right? And it was costing them $190 million of turnover, right? A year, right? And they made the assumption, of course, that the women were doing because of work-life balance, right? And when we worked with us, they clearly saw that that was not the case. There was cases that I've already mentioned to you, right? But in 3 years, they were able to reduce that, right? But the common one now is why haven't we made progress?
Oh.
Right? Because we've been able to reach mid-management of 50-50 women for the most part, right? But then after that, the lack of progress is just amazing. And for the male listeners, by the way, around the recruiting, if you're looking for your next career, become gender intelligent. You're going to be a hot asset.
Right.
And I'm not trying to sell anything, but I'm telling you, there are a lot of companies that we have worked with who say, how can we see who we're recruiting actually have gender intelligence? Are they talking about their team? Are they saying, I had some women who were just fantastic? Are they sharing that, right, versus I had an 18, et cetera? So just pay a little more attention to that as you go out there looking for a job, because the lens is on for a lot of different companies.
Yeah, I love that. I love the fact that you speak about things in terms of numbers, because I think it removes sort of like the feeling or you're just talking about results. You're saying we're losing people at this rate, it's costing this much money. Yeah. I mean, it's a business choice instead of, it's just, we want to all feel better. You're making choices that are going to improve your business overall.
Yeah, that is the way to tackle this, because we've been playing the numbers game for so long, right? Thinking that if we just fix the pipeline, Tom will take care of it. But actually, if you look at it through a business lens, you really are going to be able to create results for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so if we are a job seeker and we're listening and we're looking for a company that will treat us equally and with respect and value us, what should we be on the lookout for?
Well, I would say to the men, if you're looking out for, are you asking about the company itself?
I'm thinking more like if I'm a woman and I'm listening and I'm struggling, say my background is engineering and I've been struggling with this issue at work, and I'm looking for a company that will really value me and my skills. When I'm interviewing and I'm out there searching, like, what should I keep my eyes open for that will help point me in the right direction?
This is a great question, by the way, and a very important one. We need to do our homework differently, right? So I would say check out the Glassdoor and see what online and see what people are saying about their own company, right? Around any gender challenges and so on. I would also say that if you are a really good networker, I had an example of a guy who was one of the top guys at a technology company. He was being poached by recruiters, right? Because he was really, 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 really good and smart and results oriented, just a star, right? Mm-hmm. And he mentioned this company who I actually knew quite well because I had some other executives that I coached that had been there, and I said that culture is not for you, right? And I said, but do your homework. And he said, a couple of weeks later, we had a conversation, and he said, I went on LinkedIn, and I checked with a couple of people, and you were absolutely right. That would have been so bad for me.
Oh, wow.
And I'm so better off staying here, right? Because when companies are recruiting, they put out their glossy brochures, right? And their values and all of that stuff, right? But it's very hard for you to get inside the door and say, what's the real reality in here, right? So that's what I would recommend. Be creative in how you do your homework and find people who know of people who either have worked there or work there.
Absolutely. And do you think, sort of thinking bigger picture, sort of like from a societal perspective, where do you kind of picture that we are on the spectrum of gender intelligence? And do you think there are certain countries or regions of the U.S. or certain industries which are more equal in terms of gender intelligence or more aware than others?
Well, we're making progress. It's interesting that we're making progress in companies like financial services, right? They're really beginning to get the business case of women decision makers, right? Consumer companies, 82% of consumer spending is by women, right? Yet their satisfaction rate is quite low in their experience of buying something, just like you leasing the office that you talk about. Right? And also, the other thing is that women tend to remember everything. I don't know if you noticed that. But there's more connections to our memory centers of the brain, so we'll remember that incident, right? And the other thing also to be aware of is that when men have a negative experience, they'll tell up to 3 people, but only if it's relevant to the topic. And women will tell up to 32 people, even if it's not relevant to the topic. It's when women share, right? We share. Right. So I want to go back to your question. I don't want to see if I've derailed it.
No, I think that definitely helps. Do you notice differences by regions of the U.S.? Are there certain areas that are more progressive than others? Yes,
I definitely see, different states. And I always say you can blindfold me and put me in a state, and I can tell you where I am.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Because there are different cultures within the state. But I have to tell you, we're working with clients in Utah as an example, and they are so committed to this. I'm so privileged to be working with these companies that just have an authentic commitment to learning and figuring this out, right? So I think I see progress. Now the media isn't. It's always about the sky's falling a lot of the time in media, right? So if you're interested, read the book Results at the Top or any other book that I've written, you'll see that we are making progress in this area. Technology company, it's so interesting. I wrote an article called The Enlightened Denial of Technology Companies. Because there's such diversity, lots of diversity in technology companies for the most part, they assume that they have no gender issues, right? And yet, gender discrimination lawsuits has increased 400% in the last 10 years, right? So, just be curious. Don't deny differences, right? Be curious. Understand them. Learn from them. We're actually going to be producing a documentary on gender intelligence and gender differences that deal with the entire bell curve from, to transgender to gay, entire bell curve of gender differences. And I think it'll be a shot that's heard around the world, and we could begin to be a little more enlightened about how we approach this topic of differences.
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, I can't wait to learn more about it. And I know you mentioned that very soon you are going to be giving a TED Talk, and I don't know, obviously when it's going to be out online, but I'd love to share it when it comes out. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so I'm speaking in South Lake Tahoe, and it's called Beneath the Surface, and I'm actually going to be talking about our kind of unconscious understanding of lack of gender intelligence, and I'm going to bring some of the indisputable science that is out there and how it all plays out in the workplace. And I'm going to expand it into how it plays out in terms of how we are parents or partners or education or gay brain, transgender. So in the 18 minutes I have a lot to say.
That's perfect. You're going to be tackling a huge, huge issue. Well, where can we go to learn more about you?
Well, you can go to genderintelligent.com and interact with us from there. That would be fantastic.
Awesome. Well, Barbara, thank you so much. This discussion has been great and so helpful. And thanks everyone for listening. Thanks to those of you who sent me questions. You can send me your questions to Angela@CopelandCoaching.com. You can also send me questions via Twitter. I'm @CopelandCoach. And on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on iTunes and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.